Fascism is almost always portrayed by pop historians as an Italian ideology founded by Benito Mussolini in 1919 and exported across Europe throughout the 1920s and 30s. But this isn't really the full story. It isn't even half of it. Before fascism reached Italy across the Alps, it had already been fully conceived of within the writings of a French socialist and war veteran named Georges Valois. Though Valois has been forgotten by history, he was, for a time, one of the most important intellectuals in all of France. His synthesis of revolutionary nationalism, syndicalism, fierce anti-capitalism, and absolute anti-liberalism forged an ideology which would someday take Europe by storm. Years before Mussolini's march on Rome, Valois co-founded a think tank called Cercle Proudhon, which declared liberal democracy the greatest error of the past century and called for a new society organized against plutocracy. This think tank served as the ideological birthplace of fascism, conceived not in Rome, but in Paris. Following the First World War, Valois attempted to put his ideology into practice by founding Les Faisceau, or the Fasces, in 1925, France's first fascist party. He proudly asserted, "We are the inventors, and we were copied in Italy." Although Valois failed to build his fascist party into a mass movement, his vision was later renewed by the French Social Party in the mid-1930s. To truly understand the origins of fascism, one must first look to Georges Valois. Born as Alfred Georges Grès in Paris in 1878, Valois was raised by his working-class grandparents in the small town of Jouarre. Through his grandparents, he was exposed to a dual political heritage. His grandfather was a free-thinking Republican artisan, while his grandmother was a conservative, disciplinarian Catholic. Educated in an industrial trade school, Valois cultivated a rebellious spirit against the entrenched privileges of the bourgeoisie from a young age. At 17, he began his travels abroad, starting with a journey to Singapore. After his return to Paris, his rebellious spirit found a political outlet in the anarchist movement, and between 1897 and 1901, he immersed himself in its circles, meeting important revolutionary syndicalist theorists of the era, including Georges Sorel and Fernand Pelloutier. Both figures, Sorel in particular, heavily influenced the evolution of Valois' political thought. A full analysis of Georges Sorel's ideas and his influence upon fascist thought can be found here. Valois' intense political activity as an anarchist was interrupted when he fulfilled his mandatory military service as part of the class of 1898. Surprisingly, Valois discovered an unexpected feeling of liberation within the military's disciplined hierarchy. During his service, Valois strained himself to such a degree that he was hospitalized and discharged after only 6 months. Upon being discharged, Valois' wanderlust resumed, and he left for Switzerland in 1901 and then for Russian Lithuania in 1902, where he worked as a tutor. These travels abroad cultivated within Valois an immense feeling of national consciousness, which would inform his ideological outlook for the rest of his life. In 1903, Valois returned to France from his travels. He secured a job at a publishing house, got married, and even started his own family. Following his collaboration with organized labor, Valois grew disenchanted with the French left and concluded that economic coercion was necessary to motivate the proletariat to work. Between 1904 and 1905, he underwent a profound personal crisis. His experiences within the military, organized labor, and finally within the home as a father and a husband had produced a permanent shift in his worldview, as he abandoned anarchism and turned towards a radical authoritarian philosophy. During this period, Valois advocated for two theories which formed the backbone of his ideology. He posited both the law of least effort as well as the man with the whip. Taken together, these theories proposed the idea that human beings are inherently indolent and will always take the path of least resistance. Therefore, civilization needs a strong leader to force it out of its indolence. In the midst of this period of immense ideological development, in 1905, Valois experienced a Marian vision which convinced him to convert to Catholicism. Emerging from this period of transformation, he symbolically shed his birth name, Alfred Georges Grès, and adopted the new name, Georges Valois. In 1906, Valois entered the orbit of Charles Maurras and his Catholic nationalist organization, known as French Action. His unique blend of revolutionary syndicalism, inspired by Georges Sorel, coupled with his authoritarian framework, made him the ideal bridge between the world of the Catholic nationalists and the disaffected French working class. Despite some minor competition, Valois rapidly consolidated his control over French Action's labor policy. In 1907, he published his work, The Social Revolution or the King, arguing that the two most important movements of the age were both French Action and the General Confederation of Labor, also known as the CGT. The following year, in 1908, he launched his inquiry into the monarchy and the working class, contacting leading syndicalists including Georges Sorel. Though only one syndicalist, Émile Janvion, was even temporarily roped into French action by Valois' efforts, his outreach legitimized the notion of a monarchist worker dialogue in the public sphere. In 1910, Georges Valois, through Georges Sorel, became acquainted with another French syndicalist and disciple of Sorel named Edward Berthe. Their discussions produced a plan for a journal titled The French City. The Declaration of the French City articulated a program which read as follows: if one wishes to solve in a manner favorable to civilization the questions that are posed in the modern world, it is absolutely necessary to destroy the democratic institutions. Contemporary experience teaches that democracy is the greatest social danger for all classes of society, and especially the working class. One must awaken the virtues proper to each class, in the absence of which none can accomplish its historical mission. This declaration, the Rosetta Stone for understanding the genesis of fascist thought, was signed by Georges Sorel, Edward Berthe, Georges Valois, and a couple of other minor collaborators. It called for the destruction of liberal democracy, which it proclaimed was merely a tool of the political and financial oligarchy. The solution which the French city proposed was the organization of distinct, virtuous classes purified of liberal decadence within a new and anti-plutocratic order. Unfortunately, the French city never saw the light of day due to personal rivalries between Georges Valois and another syndicalist who Sorel unrelentingly insisted on adding to the editorial committee, named Jean Variot. Following the failure of the French city, Georges Sorel moved on to his own projects, but Valois and Berthe were determined to continue their collaboration. They were convinced that a new historical sensibility was emerging, a revolutionary admixture of nationalism and syndicalism. Valois, at the 6th Congress of French Action, stated categorically, quote, "Today it is nationalism that carries the forces of reason and sentiment that will henceforth be responsible for political transformation." He declared that the ascension of nationalism and national values was quickly replacing socialist values in the public mind. In light of this observation, Valois and Berthe took the initiative to establish their own novel and revolutionary think tank in 1911 called Cercle Proudhon. The new study group successfully fused the revolutionary syndicalism of Georges Sorel with French nationalism under the banner of the father of anarchism, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. The Cercle's stated goal was to study the French economy and commit French action to a pro-syndicalist position, blocking any return to a senile conservatism. The Cercle Proudhon met from 1911 until 1914 and published the quarterly Rocque du Cercle Proudhon. The declaration of Cercle Proudhon read as follows, quote, "The founders, Republicans, Federalists, Integral Nationalists, and Syndicalists, having resolved the political problem or dismissed it from their minds, are all enthusiastically in favor of an organization of French society in accordance with principles taken from the French tradition which they find in Proudhon's works and in the contemporary syndicalist movement, and they are all completely in agreement on the following points. Democracy is the greatest error of the past century. If one wishes to live, if one wishes to work, if one wishes in social life to possess the greatest human guarantees for production and culture, if one wishes to preserve and increase the moral, intellectual, and material capital of civilization, it is absolutely necessary to destroy democratic institutions." Here, fascism found its materialization. Valois himself explained in a 1912 lecture that, as nationalists rallying under Proudhon's patronage, the Cercle intended a scientific study of economics subordinated to national interests, organized along Proudhonian and corporatist lines. He warned his followers to avoid conventional reform-minded socialist agitation, as the project of Cercle Proudhon was anti-reformist entirely. The Cercle's greatest success was the conversion of Edward Berthe to the nationalist cause. Berthe, in particular, adorned his new allegiance in a dynamic syndicalism which blended the ideas of Proudhon, Friedrich Nietzsche, Henry Bergson, and his close friend, Georges Sorel. Berthe celebrated the revival of a warlike spirit in Europe, arguing that national solidarity embodied the same spirit of heroic sacrifice as class solidarity had in the preceding years. Edward Berthe predicted that the alliance between nationalists and syndicalists embodied within Cercle Proudhon would lead to, quote, "the complete eviction of the regime of gold and the triumph of heroic values over the ignoble bourgeois materialism in which Europe is presently stifling. In other words, this awakening of force and blood against gold must end with the downfall of the plutocracy." For Valois, the alliance between the nationalists and syndicalists represented the beginning of a war against liberal democracy, plutocracy, big capital, and high finance. Cercle Proudhon and the rising prominence of Georges Valois provoked a final, decisive conflict with the traditionalist Catholic royalist Old Guard, led by the nobleman René de la Tour du Pin and his disciple Jean Revin. These figures were disturbed by Valois' affiliations with revolutionaries such as Georges Sorel and his use of the anarchist thinker Pierre-Joseph Proudhon as a patron. Despite La Tour du Pin's national prestige, Maurras threw his full support behind Georges Valois, recognizing that his work with the left was far more useful for advancing the overthrow of the French Republic than clinging to some cliché social conservatism. Revin resigned from French Action's directing committees, while La Tour du Pin was sidelined from the movement. Valois' triumph was complete, cementing his total control over the social and economic policy of French Action. Unfortunately, Cercle Proudhon was short-lived, and its avant-garde ideals were temporarily blotted out by the advent of the First World War in 1914. Despite this, the Cercle would definitively go down in history as the cradle of fascist ideology itself. On August 2nd of 1914, Georges Valois was called to arms in the wake of World War I. Valois served with distinction in the World War, rising from private to lieutenant and receiving the Cross of War and Legion of Honor for his bravery in leading a volunteer corps franc. He once again thrived in the structured, ascetic, and fraternal atmosphere of the French military, which became a model for his vision of national reconciliation. Valois' wartime experience only increased his ambition for political independence, setting the stage for his post-war political activities. After the World War came to a close in 1918, Georges Valois returned from the battlefield and back to intellectual labor. In 1919, he published a very comprehensive work titled The New Economy. In this book, Valois denounced both liberal capitalism and Marxist socialism as bankrupt. Rejecting class struggle, he called for a new, national economic model founded upon class collaboration, organized through syndicates and corporations, and driven by a heroic spirit of victory in the service of the strength and glory of France. In 1920, Valois founded the Confederation of Intelligence and Production, which was renamed the Union of French Corporations in 1923. This organization was conceived as a professional association to counter the existing socialist unions and rebuild the country's economy on a corporative basis. The union established practical services for its members, including a placement office, a discount service, an insurance bureau, a tax information service, and even organized holiday camps. To promote its ideas and recruit beyond the circle of French action, Valois launched high-profile economic studies on specific topics, including foreign trade and money, which attracted significant attention from the press and participation from major industrialists as well as politicians. Despite all of this, from 1919 through to 1924, Valois had grown increasingly disillusioned with the elitism of French action. According to his later 1935 testimony, he found in all of French action not a single man capable of either syndical or corporative action. On November 11th of 1924, Valois hosted a rally of French war veterans intending to promote his concept of a national revolution and rally ex-combatants to his cause. In February of 1925, he founded his fascist paper, The New Century. In April, Jacques Arthuis, a close personal friend and ally of Valois, set out to found the Legions for the Politics of Victory, with the purpose of mobilizing World War veterans around Valois' new nationalist agenda. In October of 1925, Valois formally resigned from the leadership of French Action, and on November 11th, he officially founded Les Faisceau, or the Fasces, the first fascist party in all of France. He proceeded to incorporate Arthuis' legions as the core of this new party. Valois then announced fascism as French in origin, declaring, "We are the inventors, and we were copied in Italy." Valois had built fascist doctrine upon a historical geopolitical interpretation of eternal conflict between the civilized, rooted peoples of the sacred lake of the Mediterranean and the nomadic barbarians of the north, a threat that made a strong militaristic state essential. This geopolitical perspective was coupled with a societal theory that pitted the heroic combatant embodying the national spirit against the narrow-minded bourgeoisie, whose commercial virtues made them unfit to rule and whose parliamentarianism led to corruption. Valois identified the real power behind this bourgeoisie facade as a sinister and parasitic plutocracy, personified for him by the banker Horace Finelly, the director of the Bank of Paris and the Netherlands, who he accused of orchestrating inflation, controlling governments, and collaborating with Soviet Russia to pillage the French nation. At the center of Valois' economic outlook was his scientific theory of value. Valois believed that true economic value was created by scientific advancements and the labor of technicians and producers, not by the owners of capital. This theory of value led Valois to condemn the vast fortunes of businessmen as a violent injustice compared to the modest incomes of scientists and technicians. It was this fundamental rejection of the capitalists' accumulation of wealth that made Valois' rupture with French action inevitable. Fascism, as conceived of by Georges Valois, was not a defense of capitalism, but instead a revolutionary and anti-capitalist crusade to dismantle the power of high finance and build a state of producers. The Fasces embraced a radical productivism, with Valois arguing that the entire national economy must be organized for maximum output, a lesson he drew from his experiences in wartime mobilization. This led him to enthusiastically embrace American industrial methods, specifically the scientific management of Taylorism, as well as the mass production, high wages, and low prices associated with Fordism. Valois saw the American model of economics as the antidote to France's stagnant small shop economy and the key to a modern and strong economy. He envisioned the worker as a modern consumer whose high salary would fuel production, a concept he shared with contemporary technocrats, including the sympathetic head of the General Electric Company, Ernst Mercier, and even some syndicalists from the CGT. For Valois, the new corporative system was not a return to the past guild economy of the medieval era, but rather the vehicle for modernizing the entire nation. This outlook pitted Valois against France's conservative bourgeoisie, who clung to the laissez-faire capitalism of pre-war France. The Fasces advocated for a national dictatorship transcending class, aiming to establish a strong executive leadership proclaimed by war veterans, alongside an organic corporative legislature, simultaneously reinforcing a completely free syndicalism. The platform of the Fasces criticized both the liberal state as well as plutocratic capitalism, proposing instead a corporatism that would reconcile workers and employers together within the state. In the first issue of the new century, Valois launched a direct appeal to the French people, announcing the program and organization of the Fasces of combatants and producers. I couldn't find the original French publication of this program, but I was able to find an Italian translation published in 1926, which contains the following excerpts written directly by Georges Valois himself. Quote, "We are neither of the left nor of the right. We know that to save ourselves from ruin, we must make a bundle of parties. Syndicalism groups together only the producers of the same trade. It is necessary to move toward a super-syndicalism that leads to corporatism. The doctrine of the Fasces establishes, demonstrates, and proves that the idea of class is scientifically false. The Fasces of producers intended to become a parallel economic government, uniting French employers and workers by industry, above and beyond the realm of class conflict. The Fasces promoted concrete policies such as the golden salary, a wage indexed to gold, as well as social insurance promising all workers a house and a car. The movement remained predominantly middle class, while workers constituted roughly 20% of the membership of the Fasces of producers. On January 15th of 1926, Valois denounced French action as well as Charles Maurras, declaring in the pages of the New Century, quote, "I owe my formation to Barré, to Bourget, to Sorel, to Proudhon. What I owe to Maurras is insignificant." In founding the Fasces, Valois was joined by a small number of members from French Action, as well as roughly 3,000 members from the Fascist Legion of French Combatants of Antoine Radier, which had been founded in 1924. The name of the party, the Fasces, deliberately evoked the image of Italy's National Fascist Party, though Valois was insistent that the ideology of the Fasces had in fact originated in France in 1911 during his work in Cercle Proudhon. The Fasces leaders included Valois himself, Jacques Arthuis as vice president, Lieutenant André Duhamel as military chief, Philippe Barrès as propagandist, and oil magnate Serge André as an organizational administrator. The Fasces' paper, The New Century, served as its doctrinal organ, constantly contrasting the barbaric communist horde against the organized fascist legions. Much of the party's important financial backing came from figures such as the wealthy heir Franz van den Broek d'Obranan, as well as Serge André, who patiently bore the commercial backlash which punished him for his political engagements. The initial recruitment of the Fasces explicitly targeted war veterans, with Valois' anti-bourgeoisie heroism resonating deeply with men such as Philippe Barrès, as well as the broader working class of France. The French proletariat's attraction to the Fasces climaxed in a dramatic, though indeed short-lived, alliance with the communist mayor of Périgueux, Marcel Delagrange. Delagrange was even at one point hired as a technical counselor for the Fasces, while many former communists, such as Henri Laradon from the Nord, also joined the ranks of the Fasces as well. The Fasces was structured into 4 distinct sections, each targeting a specific segment of the national community. First was the Veterans Legion, or the Fasces of Combatants, which organized war veterans into paramilitary companies. The second was the Fasces of Producers, designed to be the corporatist engine of the new state, uniting employers and workers by industry. The third was the Fasces of Youth, intending to capture the next generation through university wings. Finally, there was the Civic Fasces, a catch-all for ordinary citizens and sympathizers. The Fasces' 25,000 members wore blue shirts and participated in ritualized parades. By late 1926, the Fasces could lay claim to perhaps as many as 27,000 members, according to Yves Gouchet, while they attracted as many as 100,000 sympathizers. At the same time, French Action lost about 1,800 members. Valois and Arthuis quickly became prominent faces of a militant and anti-parliamentary Third Way. The events of 1926 presented the crucible in which Georges Valois hoped to forge his new state. In the midst of a severe financial and political crisis which Valois had long predicted, multiple governments fell in rapid succession as the French currency plummeted. Valois took advantage of this crisis within the liberal order by conducting a series of massive theatrical rallies. The most significant of these were the national days, such as his pilgrimage to Verdun in February, and the National Assembly of Combatants and Producers in Reims in June. At Reims, before 10,000 people, two-thirds in fascist blue shirts, Valois unveiled his Verdun program and promised the people that the next meeting would be on the banks of the Marne to appoint a leader and inaugurate the Republic of Combatants and Producers. These events showcased the Fasces as a disciplined force ready to assume power once the corrupt parliamentary system finally collapsed. Valois hoped not to launch a violent push, but to be the only organized force capable of taking control during the anticipated collapse of the liberal state. He believed that his legions and corporations could defeat a communist revolt or general strike with confidence, allowing a seamless transition of power, ideally with some form of legal sanction from the President of the French Republic. On June 21st of 1926, Valois declared his anti-royalism and utmost loyalty to the Republican cause, announcing, quote, "We all in the Fasces have the great feeling of 1789, the great idea of the French Revolution summarized by the phrase, a career open to talents. That is, the possibility for all to access public office. We are enemies of any power that would close its avenues to certain categories of citizens. On this, we all have the Republican fiber." The Fasces' rise provoked a vicious ideological conflict with Valois' former allies in French Action. The Royalists would break into Fasces meetings, and in a relentless propaganda campaign led by Charles Maurras and Léon Daudet, French Action accused Valois of every conceivable transgression, from stealing subscription lists to being an agent of the police. To make matters worse, with the formation of the Poincaré government in July of 1926, which stabilized the franc and restored confidence, the Fasces began to lose its steam. As the economic and political crisis abated, the Fasces stalled, making it all the more vulnerable to its enemies. The fascist movement was now being strangled by a chronic financial crisis. Valois had initially launched both the Fasces and its daily newspaper, The New Century, without adequate capital. While he, Jacques Arthuis, and Serge Andre poured their personal fortunes into the venture and received crucial initial subsidies from Francois Coty and the Hennessy family, it was never enough. The newspaper was a massive financial drain, suffering from low circulation and a high rate of unsold copies. The cost of colossal rallies, including the one at Reims, and the salaries of a 54-person bureaucracy pushed the movement into unsustainable debt. Valois' constant fundraising campaigns had failed to secure a stable financial base. Desperate for allies and funds, Valois met with Arnaldo Mussolini in Milan to discuss a Latin bloc against Anglo-American finance. However, as French-Italian relations soured, French Action pounced, accusing Valois of being a traitor in the pockets of the Italians. Though Valois never received any money from Fascist Italy, the accusation stuck, tarring him as an unpatriotic sellout and giving the state a pretext to view him with heightened suspicion. The lack of commitment of Fascist Italy toward the fascist movement in France likely filled Valois with a deep feeling of resentment, which would eventually inform his denunciation of Fascist Italy later on. In 1926, the Fasces came into conflict with other leagues. Royalist members of the Camelots of the King disrupted fascist meetings, while Maurras denounced Valois as a fascist stooge. The battle culminated in Valois ordering a retaliatory raid against the headquarters of French Action in December of 1926, a brawl that saw an exchange of gunfire and serious injuries. This street violence alienated many of Valois' moderate followers, as well as his financial backers. These public altercations put the Fasces in the spotlight, while inviting even fiercer opposition from the elites of French Action. Maurras and his associates attempted to cut off Valois' organization from bourgeoisie finance, accusing them of colluding with French communists. In response to this vicious campaign by French Action, industrial backers such as Eugène Maton and powerful veterans groups abruptly withdrew their support. On June 5th of 1927, Valois, even in the face of royalist aggression, reiterated his republican and anti-monarchist views, again stating, "I have belonged to the Republic since my childhood. My fiber is Republican. For 30 years, I have worked to establish the working class in the city in the Republic. That is my goal, along with the greatness of the fatherland." In this pronouncement, Valois revealed that he had never been a monarchist. He had never believed in the delusional aspirations of the French royalists. Valois had only hoped that the conservatives of French action could yield fruitful developments for the labor movement. He was, to his core, a Republican. By 1927 to 28, internal strains and financial losses were killing the Fasces. Meanwhile, as many members hoped for a full alignment with fascist Italy, Valois began voicing his opinion that the Italian manifestation of fascism was far too conservative relative to Valois' grand revolutionary ideals. Large anti-communist financiers such as Francois Coty had expected a conservative mass movement to rise out of the Fasces, not a revolutionary syndicalist upheaval, a phenomenon which came much to their shock. When Ernst Mercier and Francois Coty pulled their funds, the party collapsed. By early 1928, hardly 2 years after its founding, the Fasces rapid splintered and was formally dissolved, with Valois declaring that, quote, "Fascism has accomplished its historical mission in France, which was to break up the old formations, to provoke, beyond the old parties, the gathering of the teams of the future." From 1928 onward, the new century dissolved alongside the Fasces, never to be seen again. Disillusioned with the direction of fascist Italy, and no longer hoping to continue the project of establishing a syndicalist state under the banner of fascism, on June 10th of 1928, Georges Valois, alongside Jacques Arthuis, founded the Republican Syndicalist Party. His new party attracted various revolutionary syndicalists, left-wing nationalist war veterans, and former anarchists such as the neo-Jacobin Charles Albert. The Republican syndicalists ran the review, the Blue Notebooks, as their media organ, where Valois and his colleagues expounded their program. Valois preserved his bookstore known as Valois Librairie and launched a series of technical, economic, and cooperative journals. Several leaders of the Republican Syndicalist Party, such as René Capetin, would later become future Gaullist leftists in progressive politics. However, by 1932, even the Republican Syndicalist Party would fade, and Valois would instead organize a network of co-ops, which he dubbed the New Age Cooperatives. Yet, as the Fasces fell, another movement rose. In 1930, the French army officer turned politician, Francois de la Rocque, ascended to lead the Veterans Association known as Croix-de-Feu, or the Cross of Fire, first founded in 1927. The Cross's motto, family, labor, and fatherland, found mass appeal. Under the leadership of La Rocque, it became an extremely important French nationalist league, claiming several 100,000 members by the early 1930s. In 1931, Ernst Mercier, who had before been drawn to Georges Valois' productivism, now turned to finance the vision of La Rocque, whose anti-parliamentary campaign Mercier found to be of great interest. La Rocque and his supporters fought for a state-guided corporative economy organized into professional syndicates and corporations that would bring harmony to employers' and workers' interests under state supervision. In his Service Public booklet, La Rocque argued for an economy, quote, fusing the interests of capital with those of the nation in order to raise living standards for French workers. This meant creating negotiated bodies of employers, employees, and state officials to plan industry. La Rocque expressed his admiration for the goodwill of industrial and agricultural syndicates so long as they remained exclusively professional and regional. The Cross of Fire, in fact, collaborated with not only Catholic worker syndicates, but also business leaders for the purpose of cultivating local social aid projects. La Rocque believed that both class conflict and partisan politics were the enemies of national unity, and that worker syndicates should be cultivated to focus solely on economic interests. In his view, syndicates had a role as sites of skills and goodwill that could strengthen the economy once purged of Marxist politics. The Cross of Fire under him was staunchly anti-liberal and anti-parliamentary, attacking the inefficiency and corruption of the political parties of France's Third Republic, while calling for a strong executive branch and national unity beyond parties and above class interests. During the street demonstrations of February 6th of 1934, La Rocque momentarily commanded the largest rally in all of France. That year, the Cross of Fire would reach its peak as its members marched in sync against the government. By now, La Rocque was referring to Mussolini as a genius, declaring the admiration he deserved to be unquestionable. The Cross of Fire had quickly become one of the most important political organizations in all of France. In 1933, Georges Valois publicly abandoned Catholicism, and in 1934, he resigned his army commission, putting him at odds with the French Communist Party. He subsequently became a focal point for the revolutionary left, attempting to build coalitions with Trotskyites and dissident communists. Despite disregarding the term fascism, it is undeniable that Valois still identified with the ideology as a whole until his death. In 1935, he reported that from 1922 until 1925, he led a, quote, anti-bourgeoisie campaign which, as he reported, was quite dynamic. He referred to this campaign as the fascism of the moment, the fascism of 1925, which he regarded as an enemy of the financial and industrial oligarchy. It was Valois' opinion that the oligarchy's opposition to the fascism of 1925 was precisely the reason that the oligarchs worked to dismantle it. He believed that the fascism of 1925 was a genuinely anti-capitalist movement, trending from nationalism towards socialism. As he later reminisced in 1935, quote, "We called for a very communizing National Socialism. That was our fascism, where I was marching in great strides towards socialism." He was convinced that the fascists in Italy had conceived of their corporatist project by observing the Confederation of Producers led by Valois between 1920 to 1925, stating, quote, "After the war, I set up a confederation of production that made a lot of noise until 1925. It was with this that I launched the Economic Weeks, which had a certain impact, and that the plans of a corporative organization that Italian fascism copied, by its own admission, were made." In the mid-1930s, Valois' economic thought crystallized around the theory of abundance. This doctrine explained the Great Depression as a structural crisis where the substitution of human labor for machine automation caused vast underconsumption. The solution in Valois' eyes was to move away from an economy of exchange to one of distribution, establishing a right to life for all. Valois integrated this with his vision of a decentralized economy based upon integral syndicalism, in which pyramids of cooperatives would create a self-regulating, non-authoritarian, socialist society. When all veterans' leagues were banned in 1936 by the Popular Front government, Francois de la Rocque transformed the disbanded Cross of Fire into the French Social Party, which rapidly became not only the largest fascist party in France, but the nation's largest nationalist party overall. By 1940, the Social Party would become the largest political party in France, period. The Social Party curated its own national newspaper known as The Torch, as well as its own youth and women's sections, providing mutual aid services for members such as food, clothing, education, etc. Millions of French proletarian families participated in its mass social programs, and by 1939 to 1940, it claimed an official membership on the order of over 1 million, dwarfing the entire French right wing. The Social Party was indeed the first true fascist mass movement in French history. Francois de la Rocque personally boasted of having 2 million followers. The Social Party proclaimed a national revolution of social classes aimed at defeating both communism and laissez-faire capitalism. La Rocque promoted the economic reorganization of France through crafts and professions. His program explicitly spoke of curating a cooperative state, where society would be organized by families, trades, and regions. Like the fasces before it, the Social Party was far from the ideologically monolithic bloc led solely by La Rocque that historians often describe. While La Rocque promoted a socially conservative vision for the French social state, the party was filled with technocrats, modernizers, and conservatives of all kinds. The technocrats and modernizers objected to the leadership's traditionalist economic discourse and pushed for far more innovative planning-based solutions. Furthermore, the Social Party's vision for youth and education was also a contested space, with conservatives and modernists constantly debating regarding the model for the new French generation. The party was overall a bastion of diverse thought, never catering too far to one faction than another. Both La Rocque and other leaders in the party publicly disavowed biological racism, declaring that the party was a fraternity open to all patriotic Frenchmen, including French Jews. The Social Party demanded that French citizens ought to be prioritized over migrant workers to prevent the gradual colonization of the French nation. They demanded both strict immigration restrictions as well as special taxes on foreign residents. The Social Party never advocated for imperial conquest, nor did it advocate for racial or ethnic discrimination or any kind of genocide, nor did it seek to replace private property. Instead, it proposed family allowances and the expansion of public works. Many members were small-town notables, clergy, veterans, and proletarians, attracted by the discipline imbued within the organization. Though La Rocque had once hoped for continental solidarity with fascist Italy, he ultimately decided that a collaboration with the Axis powers would be untenable for France, and contrary to the belief of some academics, he never called for collaboration with Nazi Germany. The economic doctrine of La Rocque and his Social Party aimed to protect the artisan, the shopkeeper, and the family farmer from the onslaught of modern industry. He and his followers virulently opposed both Taylorism and Fordism, which they saw as dehumanizing and anathema to French business practice, in which the small shop and workplace harmony were paramount. The Social Party viewed the fascist corporation as a vehicle for social justice and class reconciliation rather than for maximizing output. This vision, shared between the leaders of the Social Party and the traditionalist wing of the party, was fiercely contested by the modernist faction, including figures such as Bertrand de Maillois and Marcel Canat, who, much like Valois a decade earlier, advocated for planning, technocratic representation, and the rational organization of production. These fascist modernizers believed the artisanal tradition was a relic, and that adopting the American model would be essential for French economic survival, particularly as tensions were rapidly rising across the European subcontinent. As Europe hurtled towards war, Georges Valois' activism became dominated by a desperate race to prevent another massacre. Horrified by his reading of Mein Kampf, Valois proposed in September of 1937 an embargo against the Axis powers to cripple their militaries without any war. The embargo movement initially gained traction among leftist groups, however it collapsed in early 1938, undermined by Valois' relentless polemics and the growing momentum for military confrontation. As appeasement triumphed at Munich, Valois denounced the cowards and capitulators, correctly predicting that it would only feed Hitler's ambitions. In a direct application of his old golden salary concept, Valois launched a highly popular cooperative fund in October of 1937. This scheme sold gold-indexed bonds, allowing members of his cooperatives to protect their savings from the inflation he predicted. Savers could invest their paper francs and be repaid in either gold or the gold equivalent value in francs. The fund was a resounding success, growing to over 700,000 francs by early 1939, a prudent hedge against disaster. The outbreak of war in 1939 was, for Valois, a bitter but expected tragedy. His 1939 book, Prometheus Victorious, outlined a program to extend the economic blockade against Germany and accelerate the establishment of a distributive economy to outclass the dictatorships. Partly by design and partly influenced by the national mood, Valois presented his ideas in a far more nationalistic, less overtly socialist manner as the war awakened his latent emotive militarism. Wartime mobilization stripped Valois' New Age of staff and forced him to produce a 2-page weekly almost single-handedly. He now regrettably admitted to his past misjudgments, confessing that he had underestimated the value of liberty and misunderstood the Russian Revolution when he proclaimed it as a genuine social transformation all those years ago, when in reality it was simply a change in masters from Tsar to Stalin. Valois argued against those like Churchill, who hoped to detach Stalin from Hitler, as he saw the two tyrannies as inherently linked by ideology. Valois also mounted a final, fierce campaign against his former ally, Charles Maurras, accusing him of being a conscious agent of Adolf Hitler. Hoping to forge a new revolutionary coalition, Valois reached out to Catholics like Jacques Maritain and, most surprisingly, to technocratic businessmen such as Jean Cottrot and Auguste de Toff, who he hailed as revolutionary capitalists. His opposition to the proprietor class, which had been so pronounced during his resentful phase of the 1930s, was over, and Valois was once more ready to uphold class collaboration with renewed determination. Valois assured bourgeoisie Frenchmen that his revolution would not eliminate private property, but expand it so that all French citizens could become property owners. Valois further assured his capitalist allies that, should he succeed, many current employers would indeed retain their positions. As the war went on, Valois grew increasingly frustrated. He proposed syndical organization for the economy to maximize efficiency, arguing that France must change its social organization during the war and in order to win the war. He was horrified by Nazi atrocities in Poland, which he saw as a descent into a new barbarism. While his economic logic initially led him to doubt that a full-scale German invasion of France was feasible due to their resource constraints, he feared that internal French weakness would invite a Nazi attack. The German invasion of Norway in April of 1940 confirmed his resource-focused view of the conflict, but the subsequent blitzkrieg against France in May demonstrated the gaping hole in his analysis, his critical underestimation of the new tactics of coordinated armored warfare. On May 21st of 1940, as French defenses crumbled, Valois declared that even if the Battle of France was lost, the universal war against tyranny would continue. He blamed the collapse on treason, psychological warfare, and most fundamentally, the conservatism and timidity of the French elite. In the final issues of The New Age, Valois published his last furious, resentful, and yet patriotic appeals, insisting that the French people must trust in their own energy and never return to the dead liberal systems of the past. The last issue of The New Age was published on June 8th to 10th of 1940, just days before the Nazis entered Paris. Following the fall of France and the establishment of the Vichy regime, Valois could find no divine surprise in the defeat. He quickly fled to Casablanca, Morocco, where his opposition to the Vichy regime went on. He made contact with the Count of Paris and various anti-Vichy military officers, engaging in political conspiracy that led to his first arrest in December of 1940. He was imprisoned first in Meknes and then transferred to the military prison in Clermont-Ferrand, France, in March of 1941. Fellow prisoner Pierre Mendès France later castigated Valois' scandalous treatment, noting that he was treated like a common criminal despite his ill health and record as a war veteran. He was freed in April of 1941 for a lack of evidence against him. After his release, Valois and his wife established a new base of operations at an old mill in Val d'Ardier, in the Beaujolais region, near the resistance capital of Lyon. Valois maintained a facade as a retired publisher and market gardener as he conducted clandestine resistance. His gardening bulletin served as a perfect cover for identifying sympathizers and distributing secret communications to resistance members. From this rural retreat, Valois built a network of food production and distribution cooperatives, which he hoped could form the basis of a new society in the expected post-war chaos. Simultaneously, Valois edited the clandestine periodical Après for the organization Combat. In these writings, he argued that France had been betrayed by the Trusts, a plutocratic oligarchy operating through a secret technocratic network to engineer the French defeat. Valois maintained a disciplined anti-Gaullist stance, viewing even the Allied powers as tools of the Trusts. He argued that the French people should fight to liberate themselves rather than relying on foreign armies. Finally, in his philosophical testament, Man Before the Eternal, drafted in 1943, Valois revived the heroic vitalism that had long underpinned his fascist thought. He constructed a quasi-religion centered on a deified life force, citing Henry Bergson and Friedrich Nietzsche. Believing humanity was transitional between animal and Superman, Valois called for a new humanist religion to foster heroism and sacrifice. His ultimate vision was that mankind would reach for the stars and explore outer space for the purpose of advancing civilization. For the first time, Valois finally recognized the appeal of war, exclaiming that it served the purposes of life by eliminating weakness and decadence. Furthermore, he believed that war cultivated heroism through the virtue of risking one's own life for something greater. In September of 1942, Francois de la Rocque publicly broke with the Vichy government. He immediately began collaborating with the British Secret Intelligence Service and founded the Clan Network to gather intelligence against the Vichy regime. In March of 1943, La Rocque was captured by the Gestapo, finally being freed by American forces only in 1945. La Rocque was one of the lucky ones. Jacques Arthuis, the former vice president of both the Fasces and the Republican Syndicalist Party, would meet his fate in the Hinzert concentration camp in August of 1943, dying of pneumonia. Arthuis' fate was not much different from that of his old comrade, Georges Valois. In February of 1944, Valois had traveled clandestinely back to Paris to contribute to underground resistance pamphlets. Unfortunately, on May 18th of 1944, he was arrested by the Gestapo, who had traced clandestine resistance literature back to his activities. He was interrogated at Klaus Barbie's headquarters in Lyon before being deported to the German concentration camp system. He was first sent to the Neuengamme concentration camp before being moved to Bergen-Belsen in December of 1944. Even in the horrific conditions of the camps, he became a leader and moral pillar for his fellow prisoners, organizing talks and maintaining his belief in the ultimate victory of human dignity against the forces of tyranny. Imprisoned in Bergen-Belsen, Georges Valois died of typhus on February 18th of 1945. His final words were, "It had better be the flu, there will be so much to do soon." Following Francois de la Rocque's return to France, he was placed under house arrest by the Liberal government, who feared his return to national politics. Still under house arrest on April 28th of 1946, La Rocque passed away due to surgical complications caused by his physical deterioration in German captivity. The passing of both Georges Valois and Francois de la Rocque represented not only the deaths of mere men, but the death of fascism in France entirely. And yet, even with the sun having set on their movements, we are still left with an important question. What legacy did these men and the leagues they built leave behind? In analyzing the legacy of both Valois' Fasces and La Rocque's Social Party, we find movements which championed not hatred or bigotry, but security for families, wage protections, social insurance, and housing initiatives. We find men who took the dignity of labor seriously and advocated for placing the people at the center of national economic life. And in the final acts of these men and the movements they led, they demonstrated a genuine commitment to the sovereignty of their nation in the face of foreign occupation. The impulses that drove these movements, a stand against oligarchy, a challenge to exploitation, and the pursuit of popular sovereignty, comprised an agenda that still remains compelling today to the many who recognize the injustice of the political establishment. If there is anything that the viewer should take away from this video, it's that Valois was correct. The work of building a humane society is unfinished, and there is still so much work to be done.